Refugees of Iraq are Iraqi nationals who have fled Iraq due to war or persecution. Throughout the past 30 years, there have been a growing number of refugees fleeing Iraq and settling throughout the world, peaking recently with the latest Iraq war, precipitated by a series of conflicts including the Kurdish rebellions during the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and the Gulf War, the subsequent sanctions against Iraq, and culminating in the violence during and after the American-led invasion and occupation of Iraq. Millions have been forced by insecurity to flee their homes in Iraq. Unlike most refugees, Iraqi refugees have established themselves in urban areas in other countries rather than in refugee camps. In April 2007, there was an estimate of over 4 million Iraqi refugees around the world, including 1.9 million in Iraq, 2 million in neighboring Middle East countries, and around 200,000 in countries outside the Middle East. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has led the humanitarian efforts for Iraqi refugees. The Iraqi displacement of several million is the largest in the Middle East, and is much larger than the number of Palestinians who were displaced in 1948 during the Arab invasion of the newly declared State of Israel. Causes: Iraqi-Kurdish conflict. Persian Gulf War. On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The ensuing 1991 Gulf War produced nearly 3 million refugees, many of them from Iraq. Almost all of them left Iraq and Kuwait before the war started or after Desert Storm was over. The largest groups were the Kurds and Shias fleeing Saddam Hussein after a failed uprising, as well as the Palestinians. Palestinians were the second largest group uprooted by the war, and 300,000 resettled in Jordan. There were a smaller number of Iraqi Arab refugees, only about 37,000, mostly Shia who moved to Saudi Arabia. About 100,000 Iraqis escaped to Jordan and Syria. Shia comprise 55% of the Iraqi population, but are excluded from the government by the Sunni Arabs. There was a 1991 uprisings in Iraq. Shia uprising in March 1991. Saddam Hussein regained control of the Shia-dominated South in mid-March, and his cousin, Ali Hassan Majid, conducted public executions, bombarded city centers, and destroyed homes and mosques. 200,000 people died in the South between March and September 1991 from the violence. In 2003, there were 530,000 Iraqi refugees in Iran, mostly Shiite Arabs. 1.85 million Kurds fled to the borders of Turkey and Iran. Unlike the Shiites, the Kurds had a recognized political leadership: the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan and the Kurdistan Democratic Party that took control of northern Iraq. As a result of this formal political leadership, the revolution in the Kurdish north was much less violent than in the Shiite south, and produced relatively few refugees and internally displaced persons. In late March 1991, the Bush administration gave the Iraqi government permission to use helicopters against the Kurds. These were used to terrorize the Kurdish population. About 450,000 Kurds fled to the mountains bordering Turkey and Iran, and the Hussein government had retaken control of the main Kurdish cities by April 3, 1991. Turkey refused to allow the Kurds into the country, but there was significant media attention to the refugee population. The Kurds on the Iranian border were more isolated and received less media attention. But Iran admitted some groups of refugees and the physical conditions were less harsh than on the Turkish border. In response to this humanitarian crisis, on April 8, 1991, the UN agreed to establish a safe haven in northern Iraq. To this end, 2 days later the US and its allies established the Northern No-Fly Zone. This was in conjunction with the highly successful British initiative Operation Provide Comfort. In response to the humanitarian crisis, the U.S. tried to station unarmed aid workers in northern Iraq, but the Kurds refused to return. The US, the UK, France, the Netherlands, and Turkey then created a safe area between the cities of Ahmadiyya, Duhok, and Zakho, and excluded the Iraqi military and police from the area. Near Zakho, the U.S. military built a tent city to hold refugees, but it was not extensively used. The Kurds eventually moved to the safe area. On February 15, 1991, President George H.W. Bush called upon the Iraqi people to overthrow Saddam Hussein, which did not occur until 2003 under the administration of his son, President George W. Bush, and incited the recent Iraq War. Iraq War refugees from Iraq have increased in number since the U.S.-led invasion into Iraq in March 2003. After Saddam Hussein fell in 2003, over 300,000 refugees returned home within 2 years. But by 2006, they were fleeing again due to sectarian violence that culminated with the Al-Askari mosque bombing in February 2006. The U.S. occupation and ethnic conflict among the Iraqis ended the minority Sunni governance and allowed the Shiite majority to regain control, which worried Iraq's Sunni-majority neighbors, including Saudi Arabia. Terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda have taken advantage of the chaos and violence to establish a presence in Iraq. By 16 February 2007, Antonio Guterres, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, said that the external refugee number fleeing the war reached 2 million and that within Iraq there are an estimated 1.7 million internally displaced people. The refugee traffic out of the country has increased since the intensification of civil war. As many as 110,000 Iraqis could be targeted as collaborators because of their work for coalition forces. A May 25, 2007 article notes that in the past 7 months only 69 people from Iraq have been granted refugee status in the United States. Roughly 40% of Iraq's middle class is believed to have fled. Most are fleeing systematic persecution and have no desire to return. Iraqi insurgency and civil war resettlement. Iraqi refugees have resettled in urban centers across the world, rather than in refugee camps. 95% of displaced Iraqis still live in the Middle East, although other nations in Europe and the United States have begun to accept Iraqi refugees. Roughly 2 million Iraqi refugees live in countries neighboring Iraq. It is difficult for refugees and their children to obtain legal status in a new country. Middle Eastern countries treat them as temporary guests, rather than as refugees. Current regional host countries include Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Kuwait, Iran, small numbers in Iraq, the Gulf states, and Turkey. Only Egypt and Turkey have signed the UNHCR Refugee Convention, and even then with heavy restrictions and limited effective protection. There is also a significant number of internally displaced persons in Iraq. A March 2008 International Organization for Migration estimated that there were about 2.7 million Iraqis displaced within the country. About 200,000 IDPs have sought refuge in the Kurdish region. IDPs in the Kurdish region face unemployment and lack basic necessities. The Iraqi Red Crescent Society is the only national presence with a neutral orientation helping IDPs. The IRCS faces military attacks on its aid convoys and facilities. The number of IDPs can be expected to increase with increasing restrictions on refugees in conflicts in Iraq's neighboring countries. Host countries. Jordan. Pre-war relations between Jordan and Iraq were positive, especially economically. By 2009, Jordan had taken in roughly 700,000 Iraqi refugees since the war began, a high proportion for a country of only 6 million. Until the end 2005, Iraqis were allowed into Jordan and could register as guests for 3 to 6 months without work authorization. Renewal became more difficult after 2005 when Iraqi terrorists associated with Al-Qaeda bombed a Jordan hotel, and the number of unregistered Iraqis increased. In 2006, Jordan excluded single men and boys between age 17 to 35 from entering, then required all Iraqis produce a newly issued passport. In February 2008, the Jordanian government began requiring Iraqi refugees to apply for a Jordan visa in Iraq rather than at the Jordanian border. Only Iraqis who have been able to invest in Jordanian businesses or who employed in fields of national interest have been able to obtain long-term status and receive yearly residence permits, seek employment in specified fields, send their children to schools, and access public services. In the capital city of Jordan, Amman, the population blames Iraqis for increasing cost of housing and inflation. Health facilities are free in Jordan regardless of legal status, but facilities in Iraqi neighborhoods are overstretched and many Iraqis are afraid of being identified as undocumented. Additionally, water infrastructure in Jordan is inadequate to support the large influx of refugees. A UNHCR-UNICEF international appeal to support the education of Iraqi children in Jordan, Syria, Egypt and Lebanon will give Jordan $80 million to absorb 50,000 Iraqi children into public schools. Most refugees in Jordan lack legal status and stay hidden for fear of deportation, making aid efforts difficult. Syria has historically offered assistance to Iraqi refugees. At the beginning of 2007, the UNHCR estimated that the number of Iraqi refugees in Syria was over 1.2 million. 80 to 90% of the Iraqi refugee population lives in the capital city of Damascus. The reason for its large refugee population can be attributed to more than just geography. Until 2007, Syria maintained an open-door policy to Iraqis fleeing the war-ravaged country. Many Iraqis in Syria live in poverty, and an estimated 50,000 Iraqi girls and women, many of them widows, are forced into prostitution just to survive. According to the UNHCR, about 27% of Iraqi refugee families in Syria are without a breadwinner. Early in the recent Iraq War, Iraqis in Syria were the politically threatened Ba'ath Party, including supporters of Hussein's government. But after the fighting began in Fallujah in 2004, Shia were the main new entries to Syria. Before the restrictions were imposed, Iraqis seeking refuge in Syria received 3-month visas or permits with extension possibilities. However, the refugees are not entitled to work, but most do anyway due to LAX enforcement on the part of the Syrian government. There were few sanctions for those who overstay and fail to renew. Numbering over 1.2 million, Iraqi refugees comprise a large portion of Syria's population of 18 million. This has caused an increase in the cost of living and caused a strain on infrastructure. Sources like oil, heat, water and electricity were said to be becoming more scarce as demand had gone up. Syrian's deputy foreign minister has stated that the price of food has increased by 30%, property prices by 40%, and rentals by 150%. Water consumption rose by 21%, costing the Syrian government about $6.8 million in 2006. The Iraqi population also strained the labor market. Syrian unemployment was 18% in 2006. Refugees put a strain on health services, and Syria experienced public school overcrowding. In 2005 and 2006, Syria used $162 million to offer aid to Iraqi refugees in the country. Syria once maintained an open border for Arab migrants, and entitled Iraqi refugees to Syrian healthcare and schools. The Syrian government accepted Iraqis as prima facie refugees. However, on October 1, 2007, news agencies reported that Syria re-imposed restrictions on Iraqi refugees. As stated by a spokesperson for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Under Syria's new rules, only Iraqi merchants, businessmen and university professors with visas acquired from Syrian embassies may enter Syria. Refugees flee Syrian civil war, and targeted executions in 2012-13. As the Syrian civil war intensified, many Iraqi refugees fled the rising violence. Fewer than 200,000 Iraqis remained in Syria in 2012, according to the office of the Iraqi ambassador in Damascus. Many of the Iraqis were helped to return to Iraq by the provision of free flights and bus tickets, paid for by the Iraqi government. Tens of thousands of Iraqi families traveled back to their original country, although Iraq is itself unstable, and sectarian bomb attacks occur there almost daily. The majority of Iraqis fleeing back from Syria in 2012 were Shia, according to a spokesman for the Iraqi Ministry of Displacement and Migration. The UN Refugee Agency said Iraqis in the mainly Shia Damascus suburb of Sayed Zainab were fleeing not only increasing violence but targeted threats against them. In July 2012, the most intense fighting of the 17-month-old Syrian conflict began. Rebels took over whole neighborhoods of the Syrian capital, and government forces responded ferociously. Amid the fighting, it appears rebel fighters specifically targeted Iraqis. According to the UN, an Iraqi family of 7 was killed at gunpoint in the Damascus apartment. 23 Iraqi refugees were reported killed in July, some by beheaded, according to the Washington-based Shiite Rights Watch. The attacks reflect the sectarian nature of Syria's war, in which opposition mostly from the country's Sunni majority has risen up against the government of Syrian President Assad. Motives for attacks against Iraqi refugees are unclear, but may be due to antagonism towards Shia generally, because of their sectarian association with the government, or because Iraq's Shiite-led government is perceived as siding with Assad, though Baghdad has publicly vowed not to become involved with Syria's war. Skeptics believe it is at least helping Iran ship weapons and reinforcements to Assad's government. In March, the U.S. urged Baghdad to cut off its airspace to flights headed to Syria from Iran, and Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki pledged to curb arms smuggling across his borders into Syria. Lebanon. Many Shia Iraqis fleeing Saddam Hussein in the 1990s moved to Lebanon. A 2007 article by the journal Middle East Report reported that Lebanon hosted around 40,000 Iraqi refugees. About 80% of Iraqi refugees live in Lebanon's capital of Beirut. Contrary to many other Middle Eastern countries where Iraqi refugees are entirely concentrated in an urban center, Lebanon has instituted a policy of non-refoulement. Refugees living in Lebanon cannot be forcibly deported if their lives will be in danger in their home countries. Like in other Middle Eastern host countries, Iraqi refugees in Lebanon face the negative effects of unemployment and poverty as they cannot obtain work visas. Egypt, which does not border Iraq, became a major destination for Iraqi refugees in 2006. Iraqi refugees entered Egypt extremely quickly. Only 800 refugees were in Egypt in 2003, but by 2006, there were almost 150,000 Iraqis in Egypt. In 2007, Egypt imposed restrictions on the entry of new refugees into the country. United States. In early February 2007, the United States and the United Nations developed a plan to settle several thousand refugees in the United States. In an initial step, refugees would apply for applicant status. The U.S. aimed to settle at least 5,000 refugees in the U.S. by the end of 2007. Crystal Yuns of Refugees International supported these moves towards resettlement, but she said that the numbers remain low compared to what the needs are. A July 22, 2007 article notes that in 2007 only 133 of the planned 7,000 Iraqi refugees were allowed into the United States. of the refugees' status, U.S. Senator Edward M. Kennedy said, "We can't solve the problem alone, but we obviously bear a heavy responsibility for the crisis. Iraqi refugees looking to live in the United States must apply to the U.S. Refugee Admission Program. USRAP involves both governmental and non-governmental partners to resettle refugees in the United States. The U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration has overall management responsibility of USRAP. The Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services interview refugee applicants and review applications for refugee status. The PRM coordinates with the UNHCR for Iraqi refugee referrals. The USRAP, UNHCR, and DHS prioritize refugees who are affiliated with the U.S. government and religious minorities. Iraqis can be referred by the UNHCR, a U.S. embassy, some NGOs, the U.S. government, a U.S. contractor, a U.S. media organization, eligible family members in the U.S., and the U.S. military. USCIS officers interview Iraqi refugees in Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, Lebanon, and Iraq, and have not been able to work in Syria since March 2011. Applicants to the USRAP must fall under the U.S.'s legal definition of refugee, having suffered past persecution or have a well-founded fear of future persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion in his or her home country. Iraqis in the U.S. may apply for asylum with the USCIS if they cannot return to Iraq because they have been persecuted or fear that they will be persecuted on account of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Since 2007, 203,321 Iraqi nationals have been referred. The USCIS interviewed 142,670 applicants, approved 119,202 for resettlement, and 84,902 have arrived in the U.S., a tiny fraction of those who wish to apply. Refugees in America are usually settled in small towns rather than big cities because they receive community support that helps them navigate their new life. Other countries. Since 2006, Iraqis have been the leading nationality seeking asylum in industrialized countries. Increasing tensions in the Middle East and the treatment of Iraqi refugees as temporary guests in the Arab states has led to increased third-country resettlement options. The UN aims to register 135,000 to 200,000 to determine which people had fled persecution and would thus qualify for refugee status. In 2008, the UNHCR resettled 17,800 Iraqi refugees in countries outside the Middle East. By 2007, Sweden had accepted 18,000 and Australia had resettled almost 6,000. Sweden has seen a surge of refugees from war-torn Iraq since 2007. Sweden currently accepts more than half of all asylum applications from Iraqis in Europe. In 2006, more than 9,000 Iraqis fled the country and came to Sweden seeking shelter, a 4 times increase over 2005. Sweden's immigration authority expects up to 40,000 Iraqis seeking asylum in 2007. An estimated 79,200 Iraqis call Sweden their home. Many Iraqis fled to Sweden during the 90s as well. Current refugees like Sweden because many of their relatives are there and because of the generous refugee policies. According to the List project, led by Kirk W. Johnson, Poland, which had approximately 2,500 troops at its peak, was scheduled to withdraw its forces from Iraq by October 2008.